Greetings, my dear viewer. You're on the channel The Price of Cheating. The channel is for those who appreciate traditional family values and condemn adultery. So be sure to subscribe to the channel. Let's get started. Lillian stepped into her house late Sunday evening after a weekend away. "Anthony, I'm home!" she called out cheerfully. The lack of response unsettled her. She wandered through the house, peeking into the bedroom, bathroom, backyard, and finally Anthony's study. He was nowhere to be found. The only light came from a single lamp in the living room, leaving the rest of the house cloaked in shadow. Feeling a knot of worry, she headed to the garage to confirm his car was still parked. It was. Strange, she thought, but dismissed the unease and made her way to the kitchen to prepare a small snack. By the time the clock struck 10 p.m., Anthony still hadn't returned. Growing anxious, she tried calling his cell phone, but the call went unanswered. Memories of his unreturned calls from Saturday night and earlier that morning flashed through her mind, deepening her concern. When midnight arrived without any sign of him, she decided to reach out to the police. However, they informed her that they couldn't take action until he had been missing for a full 24 hours. Despite her exhaustion, Lillian found sleep elusive. Her husband's absence gnawed at her, especially since it was so unlike him. The next morning, she decided to stay home from work and waited until 8 a.m. to contact the police again. This time, she reached someone willing to listen. She detailed how she'd returned the previous evening and had been unable to reach Anthony since Friday. The police assured her they would send officers to her home shortly. While waiting, Lillian repeatedly tried Anthony's phone, but each call went unanswered. Just before 10 a.m., the doorbell rang. She opened it to find two officers standing there, and she promptly invited them inside. She explained everything she knew. One of the officers said, "In missing persons cases, we look for signs that might suggest whether the person left voluntarily or if foul play could be involved." They asked about Anthony's possessions, his car, keys, wallet, phone, and passport. Lillian pointed to his keys still hanging on their hook and led them to the garage to show that his car was parked. After a quick inspection, they found nothing unusual. She opened the safe to reveal his passport and showed them his wallet in the bedside drawer. Her worry deepened. Why would he leave without his wallet? The only item missing was his phone. Before she could dwell on it, one officer began questioning her rapidly while the other quietly observed. "Tell us about your husband, Mrs. King. Where does he work?" "We own Havelock Industries together," she said. "He's the CEO and I manage the administrative side." The officer nodded. "That must be quite lucrative." "We've been fortunate," she admitted. "We live comfortably." "And this behavior is out of character for him?" the officer pressed. "Has he ever disappeared before?" "Never," Lillian replied firmly. "Anthony is incredibly predictable. He sticks to his routines like clockwork." "How would you describe your marriage?" he asked, leaning in slightly. Lillian bristled. "What exactly are you implying? Was he happy? Could he have left to be with someone else?" the officer continued. She laughed bitterly. "Impossible. I'm also his secretary. If there were someone else, I would know. Anthony is devoted to me, utterly and completely." Changing the subject, the officer asked, "Where were you this weekend, Mrs. King?" "I spent it with my sister in Colville," she replied evenly. "I left Friday evening and returned Sunday around 7. "You drove?" "Yes, it's only a few hours away," she said. The officer nodded again. "We'll need your husband's phone number, bank details for both personal and business accounts, credit card numbers, and contact information for his family and close friends." Lillian hesitated. "Why do you need all of that?" "If he's out there," the officer explained, "he'll need access to money. Since his wallet is here, he must have found another way to get by." "Based on what you've seen, do you think he left willingly?" she asked. The officer's tone grew serious. "Apart from his missing phone, there's little evidence to suggest he left voluntarily." It took her 15 minutes to gather the requested information. Once she handed it over, the officers prepared to leave. "We'll keep you updated," one of them said. "If Anthony returns, let us know immediately." "Of course," Lillian said, closing the door. The interaction left her unsettled. In the patrol car, the senior officer turned to his partner. "What's your take?" "She got defensive about their marriage," the younger officer observed. "And she hesitated when we asked where she'd been. Something doesn't sit right." The senior officer nodded. "Let's verify her sister's number. That might clear some things up." 2 days passed without any news of Anthony. Desperation consumed Lillian, who repeatedly called the police, begging for updates. On Wednesday morning, the same officers visited her at the office. They requested a private conversation, and she led them to Anthony's office. This time, the senior officer took the lead. "Mrs. King," he began, "you told us you were with your sister in Colville last weekend. Is that correct?" "Yes," she replied, though her voice wavered. "Then why did you lie to us?" he asked bluntly. The question hit her like a slap. She hadn't anticipated this. The story about her sister had been her automatic excuse, a convenient shield to hide the truth. She'd never been skilled at lying, not until recently. Over the past year, deception had become second nature. "I didn't want Anthony to know," she admitted softly. "Know what?" the officer pressed. "That I wasn't at my sister's," she said. "Where were you then?" he asked. "At the Hilton," she confessed. "Across town." "Were you alone?" She hesitated. "No." "Who were you with?" His tone was firm. She faltered. I don't want to say." "That's your choice," the officer said, leaning in. "But if you don't, we'll have to take you to the station." "Arrest me? On what grounds?" she demanded. "From our perspective," he explained, "your husband's disappearance looks suspicious. We have reason to consider foul play. Now, who were you with?" Defeated, she whispered, "Dennis Smith." "Your lover?" the officer asked. "Yes," she murmured, her voice barely audible. The officers exchanged a meaningful look, but Lillian didn't notice. Her gaze remained fixed on the floor, her face flushed with shame. The officer leaned forward and asked, "Between Friday evening and Sunday night, did you leave the hotel at any point?" Lillian responded firmly, "No, I didn't. The only time I left my room was to have meals at the restaurant." "What about Mr. Smith? Can you say the same for him?" the officer pressed. Lillian hesitated, her response less certain this time. "No, he went out for about 2 hours on Saturday afternoon. He mentioned handling some personal matters." The officer's gaze sharpened. "And where might we find Mr. Dennis Smith now?" A wave of unease churned in Lillian's stomach. Things were escalating far too quickly. After a pause, she admitted, "He's across the hall. He works as my husband's deputy." The officer's expression turned colder, tinged with disdain. "Mrs. King, could your husband have discovered your affair and chosen to leave you?" he asked bluntly. "No, that's impossible," Lillian exclaimed. "We were extremely careful. There's no way he could have found out." The officer's skepticism was evident. "Call Mr. Smith and ask him to come here. Once he arrives, I'll need you to step out." Without protest, Lillian rose and walked to Dennis's office. Her voice quivered as she informed him, "Dennis, the police know about us. They want to talk to you." Dennis's face drained of color. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. Slowly he stood, his posture heavy with dread, and made his way to Anthony's office like a man headed to his execution. Lillian remained in the reception area, her mind racing with anxiety during the 45 minutes that followed. For the first time, she allowed herself to deeply reflect on her affair with Dennis. She had always compartmentalized it, labeling it as too complex to examine closely. The affair had begun out of sheer boredom. Her relationship with Anthony, after years of marriage, had grown predictable and stagnant. He no longer sought excitement, leaving their connection to wither. When Dennis hinted at wanting more than a professional relationship, Lillian had been quick to entertain the idea. It filled a void she hadn't even acknowledged. Rarely did she feel pangs of guilt, except for one particular incident. 4 months into the affair, Dennis suggested they try something new. The suggestion brought back a vivid memory of Anthony proposing the same idea years earlier. At that time, she had dismissed Anthony's suggestion outright, deeming it unappealing. For a fleeting moment, she wondered if her rejection had contributed to the monotony of their marriage. But the thought was short-lived. eclipsed by the thrill of exploring new experiences with Dennis. The current weekend, however, had not unfolded as either of them had planned. On Friday night, Dennis proposed that they both file for divorce and marry each other. Lillian's response was unequivocal. She had no intention of leaving Anthony. By Saturday, the topic had boiled over into a heated argument. Dennis's frustration revealed a side of him she hadn't seen before. In his anger, he let slip remarks that made her suspect his motives were less about love and more about securing access to her share of the company. Lillian instinctively decided not to tell the police the true reason Dennis had left for those 2 hours on Saturday. He'd stormed out, fuming. Although he returned and they reconciled temporarily, she knew their affair was nearing its conclusion. She had already started distancing herself emotionally, intending to end the relationship without arousing Anthony's suspicions. After the officers left, she and Dennis spent the remainder of the day grappling with the implications of the investigation. By 6 p.m., they parted ways, Lillian retreating to her unnervingly empty home and Dennis to his wife. That night, sleep eluded both of them. At dawn the next day, insistent knocking at her front door jolted Lillian awake. She opened the door to find a man in a suit flashing a badge. Behind him stood 2 uniformed officers and a pair of men in coveralls. "Mrs. King, I'm Detective Danny Bourgeois. We have warrants to search your home and business. We'll also need the login credentials for both your and your husband's computers," the detective said. Lillian's voice trembled as she asked, "Am I a suspect?" "No," he replied. "We're looking for any leads on your husband's disappearance." In a daze, she scrawled the necessary passwords onto a slip of paper and handed over the keys to her office. As the team began searching her home, Lillian tried calling Dennis's phone, but there was no answer. When she called his landline, Andrea, Dennis's wife, picked up. Andrea's flawless beauty had always been a sore spot for Lillian. Her alabaster skin, piercing blue eyes, and unshakable sincerity made her seem untouchable. Lillian couldn't understand why Dennis had strayed. "Lillian, do you know why my house is swarming with police?" Andrea demanded. "I don't know," Lillian replied, her voice tight. "They're searching mine too. It must have something to do with Anthony." "Anthony? What's happened?" Andrea's shock was palpable. "He's missing," Lillian said hurriedly before ending the call. As the search continued, technicians combed through every corner of her home and garage. When she tried to use her car, a technician stopped her, explaining it hadn't been cleared yet. Frustrated, she retreated to the den and played calming music to steady her nerves. By 2 p.m., the police had departed, taking her car with them. Lillian drove Anthony's car to the office, where she found Dennis already waiting. They exchanged brief, uneasy words of reassurance, their previous conflicts overshadowed by the looming investigation. Despite their shared anxiety, Lillian kept her distance, reminding Dennis to keep their emotions in check. Over the weekend, Lillian's growing fear led her to call Dennis. They arranged to meet at their usual hotel, but the encounter turned bitter. Overwhelmed with guilt, Dennis broke down. For the first time, Lillian saw him for what he was, a man whose weakness she'd overlooked in her pursuit of escape. By the end of their meeting, Lillian's decision was clear. She would end the affair. That night, remorse engulfed her, and she cried herself to sleep, convinced her betrayal had driven Anthony to harm himself. The storm had returned with a vengeance. Early Monday morning, as Detective Bourgeois knocked on her door, Lillian was still caught in a haze of exhaustion and worry. "Mrs. King, would you come with me to the station?" he asked in a measured tone. "Yes, of course," Lillian murmured, her voice barely audible. "You're aware you have the right to legal representation?" the detective reminded her. Lillian had been bracing for this moment. She'd always sensed that the police weren't done with her. "That won't be necessary," she replied with a composed air. "Should I follow you in my car, or will we go together?" "We'll use my vehicle," he said curtly. The drive to the station passed in silence, with Lillian consumed by her thoughts. Was this about Anthony? Had he been found? As they arrived, she noticed Dennis being led into the building by another officer. Detective Bourgeois guided her to a small interview room, where a female officer silently joined them. Once they were seated, the formalities began. This conversation is being recorded. Do you consent to this? Yes, Lillian confirmed. And you've chosen to proceed without a lawyer? I have, she said firmly. The detective leaned forward. Mrs. King, we've been reviewing your husband's financial records. There has been no activity in his accounts, bank or credit cards, since the Saturday morning you reported being out of town. What about his phone usage? She asked. I'll get to that, he replied. Let's begin with the day you reported him missing. You told officers you'd spent that weekend at your sister's house. Subsequent inquiries revealed you were at a hotel with Dennis Smith. Why did you lie? The bluntness of his question made Lillian's face flush. I was ashamed, she admitted after a pause. I didn't want anyone to know about my affair. The detective exchanged a quick glance with the female officer before continuing. Do you have access to your husband's business account passwords? Yes, I manage those accounts, Lillian replied. Did Dennis Smith have access to them as well? As CFO, yes, he did. The detective's tone became sharper. On the Friday before your trip, $8.5 million was transferred from your business account to Mr. Smith's personal account, and then transferred to an untraceable offshore account in the Cayman Islands. That represented nearly all of your company's operating capital. Where were you at 1:17 p.m. that day? A wave of nausea swept over her. She recalled a private moment with Dennis in the stockroom and the damning proximity of the timing. I don't remember, she stammered. I'd need my planner to check. That won't be necessary, the detective said coolly. Mrs. King, we have reason to believe your husband is dead. No, that's not true, she exclaimed, her voice cracking. He continued undeterred. There's no financial activity, no sightings, no indication he left the country. His passport is still here. Lillian tried to explain Anthony's dual citizenship and second passport, but the detective interrupted her. His phone was found last Tuesday in a dumpster near your business. Alongside it were plastic sheeting and bloodstains matching his type. Do you have anything to say? Lillian's face turned ashen. The thought of Anthony being harmed was unbearable. Her silence only deepened the detective's suspicions. No, she whispered. The questioning continued relentlessly. Blood consistent with your husband's type was discovered on your kitchen floor. Do you want to comment? Lillian could only shake her head. For the record, Mrs. King is shaking her head, he noted. We also found a prenuptial agreement in your safe. It states that in the event of infidelity, all marital assets revert to the wronged spouse. Any explanation? Again, silence. A fishing knife with your husband's blood was recovered from Dennis Smith's property. Any thoughts? Still nothing. Finally, blood matching Anthony's was found in the trunk of your car, which you claim was parked at the Hilton all weekend. That blood was spilled on Saturday evening. Care to explain? The gravity of the situation overwhelmed her. After a long pause, she said quietly, I need a lawyer. Detective Bourgeois didn't hesitate. Lillian King, you are under arrest for the murder of Anthony King. The words barely registered before she collapsed in a faint. The next day, the judge set bail at $250,000 and ordered her to surrender her passport. She managed to secure the funds through a loan and returned home, where guilt consumed her. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, haunted by visions of Anthony and the consequences of her decisions. Her phone rang abruptly, pulling her from her despair. It was Dennis. Lillian, you've got to help me. Andrea's left me and drained our accounts. Can you bail me out? Okay, Dennis, she replied, her voice hollow. She transferred the necessary funds to secure his release. The next day, Dennis called again. Thanks, sweetheart. Can I come over? I need to see you. Sure, she said, defeated. When Dennis arrived, she opened the door, her composure hanging by a thread. Seeing him there, her rage boiled over. You lying, murderous bastard! You killed Anthony! She screamed. Grabbing Anthony's gun, she fired without hesitation. The first shot struck his chest. The next 6 tore into him as he fell. The weapon slipped from her hand as she collapsed against the doorframe, her spirit shattered. Days later, her sister Ruth arrived to settle her affairs. Among the pile of mail, she found a postcard from Grand Cayman. Its message was simple, yet chilling. Wish you and Dennis were here. Love, DNA. Stunned, Ruth tucked it into her pocket and entered the house, the unanswered questions still swirling. This concludes the story. If you like it, then put your powerful like and subscribe to the channel.